I'm 33 years old now. Old enough to know better than to expect fairness from life. But still young enough that some small, stubborn part of me keeps hoping people can change. I'm not telling this story as a victim. Even though there were years where I felt like one, I'm telling it because for the longest time, I believed that if I was quiet, helpful, and forgiving enough, my family would eventually see me. And in the end, the only thing that opened my eyes was their final, devastating betrayal. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone's business, where family names meant more than actual personalities. My parents owned a hardware store on Main Street. And from the outside, we looked solid. One of those good families that people pointed to when they talked about tradition and values. I was the oldest of three. The first grandchild on my mother's side. The one my grandmother used to hold up like a promise. This one's going to be different, she'd say, her hand warm on my shoulder. This one's going to break the pattern. Back then I didn't know what the pattern was. I only learned much later that in my family, love was conditional. Loyalty was transactional. And forgiveness was a currency they expected you to hand over for free. And in the end, the only thing that opened my eyes was their final, devastating betrayal. I'm 33 years old now. Old enough to know better than to expect fairness from life. But still young enough that some small, stubborn part of me keeps hoping people can change. I'm not telling this story as a victim. Even though there were years where I felt like one, I'm telling it because for the longest time, I believed that if I was quiet, helpful, and forgiving enough, my family would eventually see me. My mother, on the other hand, believed that feelings were messy and inconvenient. She liked schedules and appearances and clean lines, things that could be polished and displayed. My brother, Ryan, was her favorite painting, loud, charming, talented in all the ways that made people clap and cheer. My sister, Chloe, was fragile and dramatic, always in need of rescuing. I became the invisible frame holding everything together, only noticed when something went wrong. As a little girl, I worshipped my grandmother, Helen. She was everything. My mother wasn't soft without being weak, firm without being cruel. She had this quiet dignity that made people lower their voices when she walked into a room. When I was 8, I told her I wished I could live with her instead of at home. And instead of brushing it off, she just looked at me for a long moment and said, "That tells me everything I need to know." Sweetheart. She never asked me to explain. By the time I reached my 20s, I had learned to make myself useful. I went to community college while working full-time at the hardware store. Then took night classes in accounting. Numbers made sense to me in a way people didn't. Numbers were honest. They didn't pretend to love you one day and discard you the next. I eventually landed a job as a junior accountant at a regional firm in the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me something my family had never provided: independence. I could pay my own bills, choose my own furniture, and go whole weeks without hearing my mother sigh and say, "If only you were more like your brother." The only person who seemed genuinely interested in my life was Grandma Helen. She'd ask about my clients, about my coworkers, about whether I was eating properly and getting enough sleep. When I talked, she listened like every detail mattered. On Sunday afternoons, I'd drive out to her old Victorian house at the edge of town, bringing her blueberry scones and updates about my painfully ordinary life. She told me stories from her youth stories about leaving home at 16, about surviving on her own, about promises she'd made to herself, and sometimes broken. She never sugarcoated anything. Family can be both a shelter and a storm, she told me once, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. You have to learn when to come in out of the rain. When she turned 80, we all knew her time was getting shorter. Her hands shook more. Her words slowed. And there were days she seemed to drift somewhere between past and present. I visited as often as I could, sometimes just sitting beside her as she napped. Listening to the old clock in the hallway beat out the seconds like a countdown. I felt this quiet panic, like sand slipping through my fingers. She was the only one in my family who loved me without agenda. The thought of losing her felt like losing the last safe place on earth. Over those last few years, she talked a lot about setting things in order. She'd mention the house, the little bit of money she had saved, the jewelry she'd inherited from her mother. Every time I tried to change the subject, she'd shake her head and say, "This is important. Melania, I want my things to go to people who will treat them with respect." She told me outright once that she wanted me to have the house. "You're the only one who actually loves being here," she said. "The others see it as a prize. You see it as a home." I remember crying quietly that night in my car before driving back to the city, overwhelmed not by the idea of inheritance, but by the simple, brutal recognition that she saw me, that she chose me, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. What I didn't know was that while she was confiding in me over tea and scones, my mother and uncle were having very different conversations with her lawyer. The day she died, the world went oddly still. I was at work when my mother called, her voice tight and flat, telling me that Grandma had passed in her sleep. Everything after that was a blur of logistics, funeral arrangements, casserole deliveries, distant cousins hugging me and saying, "She always loved you so much." Like I didn't already know. I walked through those days like a ghost, watching my family from a distance. My mother was efficient. My uncle was loud and emotional. My brother and sister drifted on the edges, scrolling through their phones and sighing dramatically whenever anyone asked them to do something. I remember standing in Grandma's bedroom after the funeral, tracing the grooves in her dresser with my fingertips, feeling like every object in the room had more presence than the people downstairs. I found one of the scarves I'd given her, still folded neatly in the drawer, and pressed it to my face just to smell her one more time. I whispered, "I'll take care of this place. I promise," like I was making a vow to her ghost. It never occurred to me that somebody else had already decided that promise didn't matter. A few weeks later, I was called to the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. I went alone. My mother had told me, almost casually, that there was no need for me to rearrange my schedule, that she and Uncle Mark had most of it handled. But I went anyway. Something in my gut wouldn't let it go. I sat in a worn leather chair across from a mahogany desk, my hands folded in my lap, heart pounding as though this were some kind of exam I hadn't studied for. When the lawyer, a gray-haired man with tired eyes, started reading, the first part sounded exactly like what Grandma had always said: donations to her church, small gifts to a few longtime friends, some keepsakes left explicitly to me, her pearl earrings, her old collection of first edition novels. I smiled sadly, picturing her writing my name for each item. And then he reached the part about the house. I held my breath without realizing it, waiting to hear my name. Instead, I heard my mother's. The house, the land, the savings account tied to the property, all of it had been left to my mother and Uncle Mark in equal shares, to be managed jointly or liquidated at their discretion. The words felt like a physical blow. I stared straight ahead, my ears buzzing, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. The lawyer kept talking, his voice low and steady. But the room had started to tilt. "That can't be right," I finally said, interrupting him. My own voice sounded small and thin. "She told me," she said. I couldn't even finish the sentence. I didn't want to say it aloud and give it a chance to be dismissed as fantasy. He sighed softly and removed his glasses. "Ms. Carter, there was an earlier draft that did, in fact, leave the house to you, but it was superseded by this document 6 months ago." He slid a folder across the desk, and there it was, my grandmother's looping handwriting, her signature at the bottom of a page that cut me out entirely. 6 months ago, right around the time her health started to decline, right around the time my mother began spending more afternoons helping at the house, right around the time my uncle suddenly became very interested in supporting Mom with paperwork. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. I left the office on shaky legs, the air outside feeling too bright, too sharp. I sat in my car for a long time, fingers digging into the steering wheel, replaying every conversation, every detail. I thought about my mother insisting that Grandma was confused these days, about Uncle Mark laughing off my visits as overkill. I thought about how tired she'd looked near the end, how quickly she'd sign whatever they handed her just to be left in peace. That's when it hit me they had used her. They had taken advantage of her frailty, her trust, her love for them and for me, and twisted it into something ugly and selfish. They had stolen from her. And by extension, they had stolen from me. And in that moment, something old and familiar rose up inside me. It wasn't just grief, and it wasn't just anger. It was a cold, clear resolve I had never allowed myself to feel before. For 33 years, I had been the quiet one, the helper, the one who let things slide. For 33 years, I had let them decide my place in this family. That ended the day I walked out of that lawyer's office. Because if they thought I was going to disappear quietly this time, they didn't know me at all. When I finally started the car, my hands were still trembling. I didn't even know where I was driving. just that I needed to be somewhere other than that suffocating office. The city blurred past my windows, as if the world itself couldn't slow down long enough to witness what had just happened. I kept seeing her signature, those shaky letters that used to write me birthday cards with soft, steady precision. Now they looked exhausted. Forced. Like they came from a woman who didn't fully know what she was agreeing to. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth I didn't want to admit: my grandmother had been manipulated, and I hadn't protected her. The guilt hit me harder than the betrayal itself. I kept whispering, I should have been there. I should have seen it. But I didn't. I was too busy trying to build my own life. Too busy believing that my family, broken as we were, would at least leave her dignity intact. Instead, they treated her like an open door they could walk through whenever they wanted something, regardless of what it cost her emotionally, or me. When I pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the parking lot with the engine running, staring at the dashboard as if it might have the answers. The world outside seemed too normal. Kids riding bikes, a couple walking their dog, someone unloading groceries. It felt wrong that life was moving on so easily when mine had just tilted off its axis. Eventually, I forced myself out of the car. My apartment had never felt so small. It was as if grief took up space, expanding like invisible smoke, filling every corner. I placed my keys on the counter, set my purse on the table, and then just collapsed onto the couch. My chest felt tight, like I was holding back a storm. And for hours, I just sat there thinking, replaying, breaking quietly. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I woke with a dry throat and swollen eyes. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, slicing the room into gold and shadow. There was an emptiness in my chest I couldn't shake. But underneath it was something steadier, a simmering strength. The kind that forms only after something inside you has snapped for good. I showered, got dressed, and drove to the one place I knew I needed to go. When I pulled onto Grandma's old street, everything felt hauntingly familiar. The sway of the oak tree in the front yard, the cracked walkway she always insisted she would fix one of these days, the peeling white paint she never got around to touching up after Grandpa died. This place was her heartbeat, her history, and now it was going to be sold, split, or destroyed at my mother's convenience. I let myself in with the spare key still hidden above the porch light, just where she left it the last time I visited. The house was quiet, too quiet, like it had been holding its breath since the day she died. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the morning light. Her teacup was still on the kitchen counter, a blanket draped over her favorite chair. It felt wrong, violated, abandoned. My family had swooped in, taken what they wanted, rewritten the will, and walked away without even honoring the spirit of what she built. As I stood in the doorway of her bedroom, my grief turned sharp again. This room, more than any other, held her essence, the soft lavender she loved, the framed photos of us on the dresser, the quilt she stitched by hand piece by piece over 20 years. I sat on the bed and traced the stitching with my finger, remembering how she once said that every mistake in the pattern made the quilt more beautiful, more human. She understood imperfection in a way no one else in my family ever had. That was when something inside me solidified. Maybe they had taken the house on paper, but they had not earned it. They didn't deserve it, and I refused to let their greed stain the last piece of her she left behind. If they wanted a war, they had unknowingly chosen the one person in this family who had the patience, intelligence, and endurance to fight one. I didn't leave the house until late afternoon. Before I walked out, I stood in the doorway and promised her out loud that I would not let what they did go unanswered. My voice trembled, but the determination behind it didn't. The next day, I requested copies of every legal document connected to her estate. It took me nearly 2 weeks. Endless phone calls, and a mountain of paperwork. But when I finally laid everything out on my kitchen table, I felt the air shift around me. There were inconsistencies. There were dates that didn't align. There were signatures from the revised will that looked nothing like her writing 6 months prior. And the medical forms indicated she had been placed on a medication known to cause confusion and cognitive impairment. My hands shook as I pieced it all together. They hadn't just manipulated her, they'd done it while she was medicated. Vulnerable, dependent on the very people who took advantage of her. It wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. I met with an estate attorney named Miriam, a sharp, unyielding woman in her 50s who spoke with the precision of someone who had dismantled hundreds of lies before breakfast. She listened to everything quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally making notes. When I finished, She leaned back in her chair and said, Melania, what your family did is a textbook case of undue influence. Hearing someone else say it, a professional, someone who didn't know me or my family, made my throat tighten. Can I fight it? I asked. She looked me dead in the eyes. Not only can you fight it, but you have grounds to win. A slow, unfamiliar heat spread through my chest, vindication mixed with grief, strength mixed with sorrow. But once we start, she added, there's no going back to how things were. I swallowed hard. There's nothing left to go back to. And that was true. The version of family I once hoped for no longer existed. Maybe it never had. For the next month, I worked alongside Miriam to build a case, photographs of the old will, handwriting analyses, medical records showing the medication Grandma had been prescribed, witness statements including one from her longtime nurse, who confirmed that my mother often pressured her during moments of confusion. Every piece of evidence felt like stitching a wound closed, painful, but necessary. My mother must have sensed something was coming, because she called one afternoon on 5 time. When I saw her name on my phone, my stomach twisted. But I answered anyway. Her voice was too sweet, too casual. The way people sound when they're hiding something behind their teeth. I was just thinking about you, she said. We should talk. There's a lot we need to sort out. Everything will be sorted out soon, I replied flatly. She laughed nervously. Melania, let's not make things harder than they need to be. You know how your grandmother was near the end, confused, forgetful. Stop, I said. Just stop. A long silence followed, and then something in her tone shifted, hardening. You're making a mistake. No, I said quietly. I'm correcting one. I hung up. My hands shook afterward. But for the first time in my life, they shook from strength. When the legal notice arrived at my mother's house, all hell broke loose. Ryan called me shouting. Chloe sent a string of tearful messages accusing me of destroying the family. My uncle tried to threaten me with consequences, though he couldn't specify what those consequences were. Their reactions only confirmed what I already knew: they weren't grieving Grandma. They were grieving the loss of what they thought they'd successfully stolen. The court date was scheduled for early spring. I remember walking into the courtroom wearing a black suit and holding Grandma's old leather-bound journal in my hand. I didn't need to bring it. I just wanted her with me. My mother sat across the room, stiff and indignant. Ryan glared at me like I'd personally ruined his life. Chloe wouldn't even look in my direction. The judge listened carefully. Expression neutrale. As Miriam laid out every piece of evidence, each one more damning than the last. My mother's attorney tried to argue that Grandma was fully aware of her decisions, but the handwriting analysis alone made that claim crumble. By the time it was over, the result was clear. The revised will was invalid. Grandma's original will naming me as the sole inheritor of the house was reinstated. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I didn't praise the victory, because the win felt heavy, carved from grief rather than triumph. I didn't do this to spite them. I did it to honor her, the only person who ever made me feel seen. After the hearing, my mother approached me in the hallway, her eyes blazing. You think you've won? I looked at her calmly. No, I think Grandma finally did. She opened her mouth to speak, but I walked away before she could. That night, I drove back to the house that was legally, irrevocably mine now. I stood in the doorway with the keys in my hand, feeling the weight of everything we'd survived together, me and her. I whispered, I did it. Grandma. And for the first time since she passed, I felt a strange kind of peace settle over me. But the story doesn't end there. Because my family, they weren't done with their cruelty. And what came next was something I could have never imagined. Owning my grandmother's house should have felt like closure. Or at the very least, relief. I thought stepping across the threshold would settle something inside me. That reclaiming the place she wanted me to have would quiet the ache in my chest. But the first night I slept there, the silence was so heavy, it felt like another presence in the room. I kept expecting to hear her footsteps down the hall, the soft clearing of her throat before she spoke, the clink of her teacup on that old saucer with the chipped edge. Instead, all I heard was the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs and the haunting realization that justice does not restore what was taken. It only stops the theft from continuing. But even that small measure of justice was something my family couldn't tolerate. At first, the retaliation came subtly, quietly, almost laughably predictable. Snide remarks from Chloe on social media. Vague posts about betrayal and people who destroy their own blood. Ryan made sure our cousins heard his version of the story. And soon enough I was painted as the ungrateful daughter, the selfish sister who took advantage of a dying woman's confusion. They twisted reality like it was clay in their hands, reshaping themselves into the victims of a narrative I never wanted to participate in. I tried to ignore it. My therapist often says that silence is a mirror. You learn who you are when you stop reacting to those who want to control your emotions. But silence doesn't work on people who thrive on chaos. Ignoring them only made them louder. Then the phone calls started. Unknown numbers. Always in the evening. Always hanging up as soon as I answered. Messages with no voice. Only the sound of breathing. Once, someone whispered my name. Soft and slow. Before disconnecting, I knew immediately who it was. My brother had done that same thing to girls in high school, intimidating them when they rejected him. Calling them late at night just to unsettle them. Some habits never die. I changed my number. 3 days later, the calls resumed from a different set of anonymous lines. But the worst part wasn't the calls. It was the morning I stepped outside to fetch the newspaper and found a stack of printed pages on my porch, copies of the court verdict, highlighted and circled in red ink, with a single phrase scribbled across the top. "You'll regret this." The handwriting was Chloe's. I should have called the police. I should have documented it all. Instead, I stood on the porch for nearly 10 minutes, staring at those papers, feeling the familiar sting of betrayal pulse through me. I wanted to believe they wouldn't escalate. I wanted to believe that losing the legal battle would finally push them to move on. But I had underestimated the depth of their resentment, and I had underestimated how far they would go once they realized they had no control left. The real breaking point came 1 month later. On a crisp autumn evening when the leaves outside rustled like whispers, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, listening to the low hum of the old refrigerator, when I heard a loud crack from outside like wood splintering. I rushed to the front door and saw my mailbox lying on the ground, smashed to pieces. The post had been snapped clean through, and tire tracks curved across the lawn, cutting deep into the damp earth. My breath caught in my throat. I walked toward the wreckage cautiously, scanning the street. No cars, no people, just the echo of what had happened. I crouched beside the broken mailbox and found something lodged inside a photo of my grandmother and me at her 72nd birthday. Someone had drawn a giant X over my face. My hands went cold. That night, I finally made the police report. The officer who came out was kind, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Like he'd seen too many family feuds spiral into things they shouldn't. He asked me questions. Did I suspect anyone? Did I have conflicts with relatives? Had anything like this happened before? I answered truthfully, and with each detail I gave him, I felt the weight of my family's cruelty settling deeper into my bones. He filed the report, gave me a case number, and said they would look into it. But I've lived long enough to know that some wounds don't get immediate treatment. Some cases don't get solved. Some traumas don't get neatly packaged into justice. Still, filing the report made one thing clear to me. My relationship with my family was beyond repair, not fractured, shattered. The next day, I met with Miriam again. She looked at the broken mailbox photos and the threatening note with a mixture of calm and fury that only seasoned lawyers possess. "You need to protect yourself," she said. "File an injunction, at minimum. But that won't stop them from hating me," I said quietly. She leaned forward. "Melania, their hatred isn't your responsibility. Their behavior is." I felt something tighten in my chest, then loosen. I breathed for what felt like the first time in weeks. We filed the injunction. For a short while, things went quiet. Peace crept back into my nights in small ways, long enough for me to start breathing normally again, to patch up the parts of myself worn thin from stress. I spent my weekends restoring the house, polishing wood, repainting trim, planting lavender like Grandma used to. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of her legacy. One the rest of my family had been too blinded by greed to appreciate. But the calm didn't last. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the nursing home where Grandma had spent her last days. The administrator asked me to come in. The tone in her voice was gentle but heavy, the way people sound when they're about to deliver news that rearranges your world. When I arrived, she led me to her office and handed me a sealed envelope. "Your grandmother asked us to give this to you," she said, but she had a specific request not to deliver it until a full year after her passing. My breath hitched. "She wrote it herself," the administrator added softly. "We kept it safe like she asked." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. It was thin. aged slightly, but her handwriting was unmistakable soft curves, confident strokes. I waited until I was back in my car to open it. Inside was a single letter. My dearest Melanie, if you are reading this, then a year has passed, and by now, I know the truth about what your mother and uncle did has already come to light. I suspected there would be conflict, perhaps even cruelty. I am sorry you must face it alone, but I know you are stronger than any storm they can summon. I need you to know something you must never doubt. I chose you. I always chose you. Not because you were quiet, not because you were helpful, but because you saw me. You saw my heart. You saw this home not as a possession, but as an extension of who we were together. Please do not let their hatred turn you bitter. That is their legacy, not yours. Your legacy is gentleness, strength, decency, and it will guide you far beyond the walls of this house. Lastly, there is something I could not change in the will, but I trust you will know what to do when the time comes. Look under the floorboard beneath the cedar chest in my bedroom. What you find there belongs to you. I love you always, Grandma. My vision blurred as I read her words again and again. A year. She had planned this a year in advance. She knew something was coming. She prepared for it. For me, when I arrived back at the house, dusk had settled, casting long shadows across the floorboards. I went straight to her bedroom, moved the cedar chest aside, and pulled up the loose board she had mentioned. Underneath was a small metal lockbox. My heart pounded as I lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. I carried it to the bed, sat down, and opened the lid slowly. Inside was the one thing my family could never take from me. And it changed everything. Inside the lockbox was a stack of envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon, the kind my grandmother used whenever she stored something precious. The box smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, like the room had trapped pieces of her memory and kept them safe just for me. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon and lifted the first envelope. My name was written across the front in her familiar cursive, soft but confident. I hesitated for a moment, afraid that opening these letters might break something inside me, or maybe awaken something I wasn't ready for. But I owed her my courage. At least that much. I carried it to the bed, sat down, and opened the lid slowly. Melanie, you have a strength you do not see. Someday you will, and when that day comes, I hope these words feel like a soft landing rather than a sharp reminder. Reading her words was like hearing her voice again. Gentle and unwavering, she spoke about my childhood, about the way I used to sit in her garden and read, while the other kids ran around shouting. She wrote about the way I listened deeply, not just to people's words, but to the quiet parts they didn't know how to express. You were born with an old soul, she wrote, and old souls are magnets for both love and pain. Letter after letter revealed pieces of truth she had never shared aloud. She described her own mother's cruelty, her father's absence, the years she spent learning to forgive without forgetting. There is a difference, she said. Forgiveness frees your heart. Forgetting frees the one who hurt you. Do not give them that gift unless they earn it. But the letter that broke me completely was the one dated 8 months before she died. Melanie, I fear your mother's bitterness will someday turn into action. She resented me long before she resented you. She sees kindness as weakness and vulnerability as a trap. She believes love is something you negotiate through control. Please do not let her convince you that you are unworthy. You were the only one who ever treated me as a person instead of a stepping stone. I pressed the pages to my chest, feeling my heart crack in a place that had never healed properly. For years I blamed myself for the distance between my mother and me. I thought if I were better, more outgoing, more successful, more compliant, she would choose me. I never realized she wasn't capable of seeing me at all. At the bottom of the lockbox, beneath the letters, there was a stack of old documents wrapped in brown twine. I recognized the seal immediately, my grandfather's estate papers. I hadn't seen them in years, not since I was a child carrying tea to the adults during those long, tense family meetings. Back then, I didn't understand money or wills or inheritance. I only understood the angry whispering that always followed. I unfolded the documents on the bed. As I read, my heart began pounding so violently that I had to sit back against the headboard. My grandmother had inherited far more than any of us had been told. The house wasn't the only property she owned. She had a significant trust fund, one that had been quietly generating income for decades. The trust was meant to pass to a single heir, and according to my grandfather's original documents, that heir was supposed to be chosen by my grandmother, not automatically one of her children. I froze. My mother wasn't her only option. Neither was my uncle. My grandmother had the legal right to choose anyone. And, given everything she had written in her letters, I knew exactly who she intended it for. She meant it for me. My face went numb. I flipped through the documents again, searching for signatures, amendments, anything that might contradict that conclusion. And that was when I found one final envelope, smaller than the others, tucked under the stack. It was addressed to me, but written in a hurried hand, shaky, uneven. The ink was darker, newer. My dearest girl, if you found this, then someone has interfered with my wishes. I do not have the strength left to correct it myself, but I trust you to see the path. The trust belongs to you, not because you need it, but because you will protect what I built, not use it to feed greed. You will know what to do. The trust belongs to you. My breath caught, my vision blurred. She had chosen me, not out of pity, not out of obligation, out of love, out of trust, out of recognition for the woman she believed I was. And my mother and uncle had stolen that from her. They had stolen her voice, her last wishes, her final chance at choosing her legacy. No wonder they had rewritten the will. The house was never the real prize. The trust fund was. If it came to light, they stood to lose everything. And they must have known. They must have suspected that Grandma had chosen me. Why else would they push so hard to isolate her, to adjust her medication, to control her environment, to ensure they were the ones handling her documents? It wasn't just selfishness. It was calculated, deliberate, predatory. I felt anger rise inside me, not the sharp, explosive kind, but the slow-burning, righteous kind that fills your lungs until you feel taller, louder, stronger. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting her, defending her, restoring what they stole, not for my benefit, but for her dignity. I gathered the letters, the trust documents, the envelope written in her fragile hand, and drove straight to Miriam's office. She saw me walk in and immediately cleared her schedule. I laid everything on her desk and told her every detail. She read silently, only pausing to adjust her glasses, her expression darkening by the minute. When she finally looked up, she said, "Melanie, this isn't just undue influence. This is a state fraud, and not a small one." My heart pounded. What does that mean? It means, she said slowly, your mother and uncle could face criminal charges, real ones. And as for the trust, she tapped the documents lightly. These give you a legitimate claim. I didn't know whether to cry or collapse. I had walked into the office thinking I had already fought the hardest battle of my life. I hadn't realized the war was only beginning. For weeks, Miriam and I gathered evidence letters, financial records, witness testimonies, old signatures compared to the forged ones. The deeper we looked, the more rot we uncovered. My mother wasn't just involved. She was the architect. My uncle had followed her lead. It was a perfect storm of greed and opportunity. And as we prepared to file the case, something unexpected happened. One evening, just after sunset, I received a message from an unknown number. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a video. My heart dropped as I watched. It was taken inside the nursing home a month before my grandmother died. My mother was sitting beside her bed, holding a document in front of her. Grandma looked disoriented, unfocused. My mother kept pointing to the bottom of the page, telling her to sign here. When Grandma hesitated, my mother gripped her hand and forced the pen into her fingers. My stomach twisted. I felt sick, cold, shaking. Whoever sent the video saved it for a reason, and now they were sending it to me. Attached was a single line. She wanted you to know. I didn't recognize the number. I still don't know who recorded it. Maybe Anurse. Maybe someone my grandmother confided in privately. Maybe someone who saw what was happening and couldn't interfere, but couldn't ignore it either. But the message was clear. She wanted you to know. The next morning, I gave the video to Miriam, and that was when everything changed. We filed the criminal case. We filed the civil case. And we filed a petition to transfer the trust to me. As my grandmother intended. My mother didn't take it well. The phone rang for hours. Endless messages. Threats. Pleas. Accusations. Insults. Chloe sent a voice memo sobbing that I was destroying our mother. Ryan told me I was no better than a thief. But this time, their words slid off me like water. Because I had something stronger than their hatred. I had the truth. And I had my grandmother's voice guiding me. The next court hearing was scheduled. It would decide everything: the trust, the charges, the legacy. And I wasn't afraid. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them. But what happened in that courtroom was something none of us expected. The morning of the final hearing arrived with an eerie stillness. The kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. I woke before sunrise. Not because of nerves, but because my body simply refused to rest. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring out at the lake behind my grandmother's house. Mist floated just above the surface, and the sky was still a deep, bruised blue. It reminded me of her the way she used to stand by that window with her cup of tea, watching dawn slowly pry open the day. She said the lake always looked honest at sunrise, stripped of all its illusions. That morning, I finally understood what she meant. The truth doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't need noise. It simply exists, waiting for the moment it can no longer be ignored. I dressed quietly, choosing a dark navy dress and a long gray coat. Not armor. Exactly. But something that felt like steadiness. Like a reminder that I wasn't the fragile version of myself my family always chose to see. I gathered the documents, the letters, the video, and tucked her last note into my coat pocket. I didn't need it for evidence. I needed it for courage. When I pulled up to the courthouse, Miriam was already waiting at the steps. She gave me a small nod, the kind that said she understood the weight of this moment without needing words. Together, we walked inside. My mother was standing near the far wall with her attorney. When our eyes met, something inside me froze. Not fear, not regret, but recognition. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair pinned too tightly, her expression wavering between indignation and panic. My uncle sat beside her, his leg bouncing nervously. Chloe clung to our mother's arm, mascara already smudged. Ryan paced like he'd rather be anywhere else. They looked like a family in crisis, but they didn't look like mine. When the judge entered, the room shifted. Everyone sat straighter. Everyone went quiet. The air seemed to hold its breath again as the proceedings began. For an hour, attorneys presented evidence, examining documents and explaining signatures. The forged pages were displayed on screens for the entire courtroom to see. The discrepancies in handwriting were jarring, obvious even to someone untrained. Then came the medical records. The notes about her medication, the days she had been confused, disoriented, dependent. I tried not to cry. I tried not to look at the empty chair beside the witness stand where she would have sat if she were alive. But grief crept up my throat anyway. Not the wild, messy grief that tears you apart. The quiet kind. The kind that whispers. She deserved better. And then the judge asked if there was any additional evidence. Miriam stood and pressed play on the video. The room went still. The shaky footage showed my grandmother lying in her bed, frail, exhausted, her eyes clouded with confusion. My mother hovered over her, holding a pane against her fingers, guiding her hand forcibly to sign. There was no tenderness, no patience, only impatience and control. My mother repeatedly said, "Just sign here. Mom, it's okay. It's just a form." My grandmother's voice trembled as she asked, "What is this?" My mother didn't answer. She just kept pressing her hand down. Someone in the courtroom let out a soft gasp. My mother's attorney objected something about privacy, legality of recording, but the judge overruled. The video had been given lawfully. Its authenticity wasn't in question. When the footage ended, nobody spoke. Even my siblings looked shaken. Chloe had a hand over her mouth. Ryan stared down at the table, jaw clenched, pretending he didn't see what we all saw. My mother looked at me then. Really looked. The fight drained from her eyes, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar: fear. Or maybe the realization that there were finally consequences for the choices she made. I didn't look away. For once in my life, I held her gaze, steady and unblinking. She was the one who broke first. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was flat, but there was a weight to it that made the room feel heavier. The revised will was void. The original will was fully reinstated. The trust legally belonged to me, and there was probable cause to move forward with criminal charges against my mother and uncle for fraud, coercion, and undue influence. Those words didn't feel like victory. They felt like justice. And justice, True justice is never triumphant. It's solemn, heavy. It costs more than it gives back. My mother started crying silently. Not the dramatic sobbing she used whenever she wanted sympathy, but the hollow, stunned kind. My uncle muttered something obscene under his breath. Chloe collapsed against the bench. Ryan stormed out of the room. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just breathed. Because for the first time in my entire life, breathing felt like something I had earned. After the hearing ended, I walked out into the hallway alone. I expected my mother to chase after me. I expected my siblings to shout, to beg, to break, but none of them approached me. They moved as if an invisible line had formed between us, one they knew they could no longer cross. Outside, the sky had finally cleared. The sun was bright and clean, as though the world had been rinsed overnight. I stood on the courthouse steps and closed my eyes, letting the cold air settle against my skin. It was done. Truly done. Miriam joined me after a moment, handing me a copy of the ruling. How do you feel? She asked softly. I took a long breath, like something heavy is gone. Good, she said. Now you can grieve the way you were meant to. And she was right. For so long, my grief had been tangled with guilt and anger and confusion. Now it was just grief pure. Simple. Painful. The kind that softens, rather than hardens. I returned to my grandmother's house that evening. I made a cup of tea the way she used to 2 sugars. A slice of lemon. I sat on her old sofa with the fireplace crackling softly, the lake glowing silver outside the window. I cried for her. I cried for the girl I had been. I cried for the version of family I once believed in. And when the tears finally stopped, I felt something inside me settle. Not fully healed, not fully whole, but steady. My grandmother's trust would go toward things she would have approved of: restoring the house, supporting charities she loved, helping young women who had been abandoned or manipulated by their families. Her legacy would not be measured in money. It would be measured in the lives she touched through me. And when the tears finally stopped, I felt something inside me settle. Not fully healed, not fully whole, but steady. In the months that followed, my family scattered. My mother moved in with Chloe for a while. Ryan distanced himself. My uncle fought the charges until the bitter end, but none of them reached out to me, and I stopped waiting for them to. I whispered into the fading light, I hope I made you proud. The breeze answered in its own quiet way. In that moment, I understood something she had always known. Sometimes the family we are born into is only the beginning of the story, not the end. Sometimes real family is found in the people who choose you, who see you, who lift you when the world forgets your name. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you become that person for yourself. If you listen to my story all the way to the end, thank you, truly. And if you've ever been made to feel small or invisible by the people who should have loved you the most, I hope you find the strength to choose yourself, the way I finally did. If this touched you, please like, share, subscribe, and tell me your story in the comments. I read every word.